All right, hello, and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker, and today I have a Shroud of Turin update. So I've got at least three pieces of news related to the Shroud of Turin. And the first is based on my Shroud Wars panel review, part 16. And if you've been following along, I've had a series of at least four shows now with a fifth one planned later on between me and Hugh Farey as an actual debate, a formal debate on his image forming hypothesis. And that was going to be in my panel review part 16E. But I received an email, so that the debate's going to have to wait. That'll be part 16F. That's still going ahead. And once I finally get some time to start preparing for that debate. But in the meantime, I'm going to do part 16E because it's come to my attention that the ultimate Shroud skeptic, Hugh Farey, has written, and here it comes, my favorite word, a peer-reviewed paper in the same journal that Giulio Fonte has about his image-forming hypothesis. And he's kind of given a counter to what Giulio Fonte has presented in the two peer-reviewed journals he has. But for once, instead of just posting it up on his non-peer-reviewed blog site, kudos to Hugh here. He's posted it in the same peer-reviewed journal as Giulio Fonte, and it's been accepted. So I think that deserves some credit. And because of that, I will be reading. Now, Hugh hasn't asked me to read that, but I'm going to read it. It's a short paper. It's only 3 pages long. But the reason I want to read it is, again, for fairness and for context, because Giulio Fonte has just published his response in the peer-reviewed literature refuting Hugh Farey's peer-reviewed paper as a response to Giulio's 2 earlier peer-reviewed papers and that sort of thing. So this is panel review part 16E, where I am going continuing on the conversation, this time in strictly peer review, between Hugh Farey and Giulio Fonte getting his final word responding to Hugh's peer-reviewed paper. So with that, the second thing that I'll be looking at is Hugh Farey, the ultimate Shroud skeptic, has written a new blog about me and Bayes' theorem. And it's a very short blog. I don't have a lot to say about it. I think it's fine. It's a piece of satire, as beloved Danny Boy Porter phrases it. And like I said, hey, if I can give it, I can take it. I can get a kind of a chat. You're allowed to use satire as a Christian to make a point, an edifying point. But we're going to see, does Hugh actually raise an edifying point against me in my use of Bayes' theorem or not? I think he raises an edifying point, but it's just not applicable to me in my use of Bayes, and I'll explain that. Thirdly and finally, as a request for Annette Cloutier, again, I know that's not how you pronounce the name, sorry, but so I was originally going to do a show on Nicholas Allen because James Tabor goes for Nicholas Allen's hypothesis. But things happen in the background and things are getting busy and stuff like that. So instead of doing a full show responding to Nicholas Allen, where a lot of my feedback and critiques with maybe about three to four updates, which don't really affect the main point. I think my previous shows on panel review show part 9 with the ultimate Shroud skeptic Hugh Farey, in which Nicholas Allen was invited to be on that show, but he wasn't, but instead gave me his book to post on my blog for people. And my previous solo show, part 11 or part 11C, because that contains the copyright or credit information for the photos from Nicholas Allen in it. Go and check out those shows. I'm just going to play a nice short little clip from Barry Schwartz giving a short critique as an actual photographic expert, the official STIRP photographer, and remind everybody why Nicholas Allen's theory or hypothesis fails to reproduce the Shroud of Turin's images. And then I'll give an update based on Annette's request, which is something that I've never heard before that Nicholas Allen raises about the Pilgrim's medallion. So that's the plan of action for today's podcast. First and foremost, let's get into the newest results of the peer-reviewed papers between Hugh Farey and Giulio Fonte. Okay, so starting with Hugh Farey's. So it's in the same peer-reviewed journal, Medical and Clinical Case Reports, journal, and it's entitled Turin Shroud, A Medieval Technique by beloved Hugh Farey. This is Hugh responding to, in part 16D, I read out Giulio Fonte's paper. So let's just see what Hugh has to say in his abstract. Again, Hugh didn't ask me to read out his paper word for word, but since Giulio asked me to read his newest paper that I'll be showing you in a minute, I just want to provide the full context so that you know, okay, what is Giulio responding to and refuting? What was it Hugh actually said? So let's start with reading Hugh, quote unquote. 2 recent papers in the Medical and Clinical Case Reports Journal have included reviews of some experiments by this author, in other words, Hugh Farey, suggesting possible mechanisms by which the image on the Turin Shroud may have been created in the Middle Ages. Unfortunately, he finds that excessive zeal for an alternative, first century explanation has clouded these reviews and hopes by contributing an article himself, he may help readers clarify their understanding of his work. So again, this is Hugh referencing himself. He's saying, well, since Giulio's done 2 peer-reviewed journals, I'm going to submit my paper for peer review, and it was published. Okay, introduction. The Turin Shroud is a 4.4 meter long cloth preserved in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy, because it has long been regarded as the cloth in which Christ was wrapped, according to the Gospels, for his burial. Its most remarkable feature is the double image, frontal and dorsal image of a man, front and back and head to head. Well, that's not true, Hugh. There's a water stain there. It's not head to head. Anyways, this isn't for my comments. I'm just reading what Hugh says. So, quote unquote, front and back and head to head, apparently representing the figure of Christ as he lay in his tomb. It has a well-known history as far back as the mid-14th century, but its identity as a genuine relic, rather than as a representation, dates from hundreds of years later. Although it was reliably radiocarbon dated to the 14th century in 1988, many Christian scholars have tried to find possible references to this cloth between the death of Christ and the 14th century, and therefore to discredit the radiocarbon date, and thus establish that the shroud is indeed what it purports to be, a genuine relic. And I wonder when I'm reading Hughes, if I could only put on that British accent, the wit of the Brit. But I tried it earlier before I started recording and I was butchering it. So I'm just going to continue reading in my own voice. I'm doing you guys a favor. Anyways, so Hugh says, quote unquote, a major argument for this case is that the image has not been precisely reproduced to the satisfaction of those who hold the authenticist view, adding credence, in their opinion, to the possibility of a miraculous origin. However, a number of possible artistic methods have been explored, which, within the rather vague constraints enforced by such knowledge of the cloth and its image as has been established, have provided a satisfactory proof of concept, if not a definitive answer to the question, how was it done? The papers criticizing the experiments carried out by this author are predicated on the assumption that the shroud is authentic, effectively removing the need to evaluate them. After all, goes the argument, if the shroud image was formed in the tomb of Christ, then it could not have been created in the Middle Ages. However precise an attempt to match it may be, the irrefutable logic of this argument, baseless though its premise is, has persuaded the author, Hugh Farey, of the criticism that abuse and mockery are appropriate adjuncts to his review, which this present author deplores. So I'm not okay, so Hugh Farey is saying that he is adopting a mocking and abusive tone, and he feels justified in doing so because he thinks Giulio Fonte has done that first. So that's what Hugh is saying here in his introduction to the paper. Very interesting. Okay, next section, agreed characteristics of the Turin Shroud image. In 1978, a team of scientists from the US examined the shroud to try to discover how the image was made. That's STIRP. It was photographed by visible, ultraviolet, and infrared light Examined using a portable microscope and fibers relieved from the surface using sticky tape, it was clear that the marks representing blood flows were of a different nature from the marks representing the body image itself. The observations of the scientists who studied the fibers were seriously conflicting, especially regarding the role of iron oxide, which was found in trace amounts, non-uniformly, all over the shroud. Heller and Adler considered it of no relevance to image formation, while Walter Macrone, the godless atheist, thought it made a substantial contribution. After detailed study, both Heller and Adler and Macrone, and later Ray Rogers, all decided that a yellowish layer over the fibers was the primary chromophore. But all disagreed as to the nature of the layer and how it became colored. This sort of disagreement among scientists who were able to study the shroud fibers in person and microscopically is not conducive to anybody being able to duplicate a method of manufacture to everyone's satisfaction. So this author, namely Hugh Farey, the ultimate shroud skeptic himself, who has himself studied all the relevant literature, compiled a target list of his own and attempted to meet them all as best he could. The author of the reviews, so Giulio Fonte, in turn compiled a separate list and decided that because I had failed to meet some of his criteria, and Hugh Farey admitted to his failure on this front, at least in some cases, he says, my Hugh Farey's endeavors were a total failure. I think this is misguided and driven more by conviction that I must be wrong rather than an objective assessment. The review author, Giulio Fonte, even finds it appropriate to quote a comment from a YouTube video to the effect that I am a quote-unquote snake in the grass. So that comes from Redeemed channel. Thank you for your feedback and comments. That was on my Real Seekers podcast, where Redeemed said that, and Giulio Fonte is quoting from my video, my Real Seekers video, where Redeemed gave his comment about Hugh. But Hugh has taken issue with this, and he says, quote unquote, Giulio Fonte even finds it appropriate to quote a comment from a YouTube video to the effect that I am a quote unquote snake in the grass. A moment of egregious abuse, which in my opinion reflects more the character of the review author of Giulio Fonte quoting than it does to the present author it allegedly describes, than it does to himself. So in other words, Hugh Farey is kind of returning a tit for tat here, and he himself is saying, Giulio Fonte, you are a snake in the grass. That reflects you because you quoted this more than it does me. That's what Hugh is saying. So he's repaying insult for insult, so to speak. Okay, so Hugh goes on. By studying photographs taken in 1988 at various scales, it is obvious that the shroud is not a painting in a conventional sense. There are no brushstrokes, no big flakes of paint, no outlining or underdrawings, and no snow fencing, a term to describe the buildup of pigment on one side only of a succession of threads as the brush swept across them. Also, the intensity of the color is greatest on the more protuberant parts of the body, such as the nose and beard, deltoid muscles, and knees, rather than the more recessive parts, which, if observed on a living person, are most likely to be in shadow and thus darker than the more protuberant parts. A side effect of this is that when the colors of the image are inverted, the resultant image, with its light protuberant and dark recessive parts, looks more quote-unquote realistic than the original. This phenomenon has been likened to that of looking at a positive print of a negative photograph, and has led some people to think the phenomenon is actually photographic, such as Nicholas Allen, the Shroud skeptic, for example, which is totally untrue, according to Hugh Farey. Real photographic negativity would also represent genuinely darker parts of the anatomy, such as the mustache and the extensive quote-unquote bruising on the face and shoulders. as light on the cloth and dark on the inverted image. But this is not the case that we find on the Shroud Man. Being protuberant, they appear dark on the cloth and light on the image. Subjecting the image on the shroud to three-dimensional image enhancement software produces an apparent three-dimensional model, which in some respects mimics the contours of a real face. Every one of the characteristics described above is easy to emulate using a technique involving the dabbing of a damp, colored pad onto cloth fastened over a bas-relief, a fact not questioned by the author of the critical reviews, not questioned by Giulio Fonte. So he's saying that Giulio Fonte agrees that, yes, Hugh can reproduce the three-dimensionality of the Shroud's images. And indeed, Giulio did grant that in his two peer-reviewed papers. Hugh goes on, quote unquote, Giulio's claim to comprehensive impossibility rests on his individual resolution of the uncertainty regarding the primary chromophore described above and on some personal observations of his own, which are not accepted as valid by me, Hugh Farey. To effect a compromise between the conflicting descriptions of the role played by iron oxide and a yellowish coating, I used a medium composed of yellow ochre, egg yolk, and vinegar, all mixed with water, a fairly common medieval recipe for tempera paint. Having obtained an image of a bas-relief by dabbing this paint on a cloth fastened over it, the cloth was then thoroughly washed and scrubbed to remove as much of the ochre as possible, and concomitantly most of the egg yolk and residual vinegar, leaving only a faint stain on the cloth composed of residual medium, and, it was hoped, some yellowing of the cloth itself brought about by the chemical action of the organic acids in the vinegar. Now, Hugh says, to a certain extent, all this seems to have been realized, although the ratio of ochre to vinegar in my homemade tempera was probably too great. For, as Giulio Fonte pointed out in his peer-reviewed papers, the pigment particles are still very evident, and the yellow stain is very slight. I think Giulio said it was non-existent, but maybe he said very slight. I'll have to go back and double check that. Anyways, Hugh goes on, quote unquote, similarly, there was probably too much egg yolk, as some of the fibers of my experiment were stuck together by it, which is not evident on the shroud. So there was cementation there, and Hugh has to readily agree with this. And he's, well, if I just fudge with the formula a little bit, this is looking like a potential problem that I might raise during the debates, that, medieval artists had to get this precise formula. How plausible would that be? Did they just happen to get it by accident? Anyways, again, it's just going to continue on reading. So Hugh goes on, nevertheless, I think this is as close as I can come to an accurate reproduction of the Shroud's image-making method, without having the uncertainties explained above resolved. Now, just a side note from me, Dale. Hugh, if you knew you were going to... so, again, I give you congratulations for getting your paper published in a peer-reviewed journal. Credit where credit's due. But what you should have done, I think, when you make these kind of ad hoc, meaning for this, just for the sake of saving your theory, these ad hoc presumptions, which I think are reasonable. It's not just a one and done thing, and then you're falsified for sure. But why didn't you try other experiments? Again, I don't think it. I think in terms of finances, you could have afforded to do maybe 10 experiments or something. I have no practical knowledge, but if it was affordable and something you could have relatively quickly done, why didn't you test out different combinations like you suggest here, and then submit those so it's new results for this peer-reviewed paper, instead of just going, well, I'm just going to complain about what Giulio said in his last paper, which again is your right. You have the right to do that and to correct the record as you see in the peer-reviewed literature. So I'm not saying that isn't allowed. Obviously, Giulio is doing that against you in his peer-reviewed papers and in the next one I'm going to read. So that's totally fine. But I'm just saying, if I were you, if you wanted to lend credibility when you say a criticism like this, like, oh, I just happened to screw up the formula, but trust me, if I fixed it, it would all not be a problem. Why not take the effort to actually do those experiments? Maybe try 10 different combinations of trial and error to see, is it getting better? Is it actually getting better? Are you actually getting these results or not? Or is your process just inherently garbage and not going to produce the results? That would have been a fascinating contribution to the scientific literature here, and worthy of a peer-reviewed journal paper. A lot more worthy than just, hey, I don't like what Julio called me a snake in the grass. I didn't like that. That wasn't good. That was mean, or something. That's the only critique I would have. It's not even it's just, I wish that you had done that. I would have respected that a whole lot more, instead of you just saying, trust me, guys. If I just switched up the formula, maybe a little less egg yolk, a little more vinegar, it all would have worked out. Why didn't you do that? You were submitting a paper for peer review in a scientific medical journal. For goodness sakes, why didn't you take the effort to try a few experiments and submit them as new information backing up your claims here? Because otherwise, it just looks like there's an ad hoc desperation of, well, Julio gave his critiques based on science, his observations of the samples you provided him, and you yourself are agreeing, yep, Julio's observations and critiques were correct. My method sucked. It didn't work. But trust me, if I had done this differently, if I had just did the experiments wearing a pink tutu, it all would have worked out and everything would have been perfect, just like we see with the Shroud of Turin. Maybe, but we're talking science here. Why don't you have the observations to back it up? That would have been so much better. Anyways, I'm going to just go back to reading Hugh. Again, I want to be fair to both sides, and but that's just a wish that I had. Like, it would have been so great to see in the peer review, because then there would be new observations, and Julio's peer-reviewed paper that we're going to be looking at next, kind of thing here, right? Commentary on. Then Julio could comment on those new findings based on observational science. That's actually progressing the conversation a lot better than just, hey, Julio is mean to me, so I'm going to be mean back to him. You know what I mean? Anyways, but Hugh says, quote unquote, to assist in his refutation of my experiments as, quote unquote, complete failures and, quote unquote, demonstrations of the absurd, and to reinforce his suspicion in a scientific journal, exclamation point, that my destiny is to be suffering in hell. Julio Fonte includes in his list of characteristics, which he thinks my experiment fails to conform to, some items which are contradictory. The idea that the image is both photographic and also not photographic. Some which are disputed, the idea that there are images on both sides of the cloth, but no discoloration within its thickness. So that's referring to the double superficiality feature of the body images, and some of which are evidently wrong. The idea that the image is not found in the interstices where threads overlap. I, Hugh Farey, have already discussed the pseudo-photographic nature of the image, so I will not reiterate it now. However, in an interesting paper involving a fair amount of image enhancement, the review author, so Julio Fonte, has previously demonstrated the possibility that a very faint copy of the principal image is also visible on the reverse side of the cloth. As it happens, parts of my experiment also seep through to the other side, but the review author insists that on the shroud there is no apparent connection between the two images in terms of color transmitted through or between the threads. However, this seems to be contradicted by his own observations in another paper, that the colored fibers of the main image in fact continue deep into the interstices between the threads. And let me just see, paper 8. What paper is that he's... So that is by Julio Fonte and Paulo de Lazzaro and Botella, called Microscopic and Macroscopic Characteristics of the Shroud of Turin Image, Superficiality. Yep, from 2010. All right, so I can link to that paper in the blog for you guys to confirm or disconfirm what Hugh is saying. Quote unquote, all in all, I think I, Hugh Farey, make a fair case for the shroud image being derived from the dabbing of tempera onto a cloth stretched over a bas relief, which over time has lost most of its yellow ochre or red ochre, because I think Hugh goes for yellow ochre, pigment, and probably gained in the yellowing of the surface of its threads. This view may be contrasted with Giulio Fonte's first conclusion, that I have, quote unquote, completely failed to reproduce the Turin Shroud body image, and his second conclusion, that I, Hugh Farey, am among those individuals who lack scientific credibility and continue to make unfounded assertions, equivalent in value to declaring that the earth is flat. It is regrettable that Giulio's opinion of my work is based less on a dispassionate assessment of its quality and more on religious fervor, claiming that the Turin Shroud provides us with such powerful proof, beyond any reasonable doubt, of the existence of God, that believers can transform their faith in God into certain knowledge of God, which is infinitely better. Final section of Hugh's paper, the radiocarbon date, medieval. Hugh says, a significant factor in Giulio's rejection of the experimental findings discussed in this paper is his unshakable conviction that the Turin Shroud is the actual burial cloth of Christ. Naturally, this flies in the face of the date of manufacture derived from radiocarbon dating, in the face of successive papers either finding it medieval or, after challenging the finding, not refuting the medieval date. This is irrational. In 1988, 3 teams of scientists from Tucson, Zurich, Switzerland, and Oxford, UK, submitted small samples of the shroud to radiocarbon dating and found that, quote unquote, the results provide conclusive evidence that the linen on the Shroud of Turin is medieval. However, a remark in the paper observing that the spread of the measurements for sample 1, the Turin Shroud, is somewhat greater than would be expected from the errors quoted. And this has encouraged some statisticians to request more comprehensive data from the tests, with a view to understanding this anomalous spread of measurements. Papers by Riani, Casabianca, and Schwalbe and Walsh established that the samples tested, originally cut in a line from the one corner of the shroud, had produced results implying a chronological gradient or slope along the line. The Oxford sample appearing the oldest and the Tucson sample the youngest. It had thus been inappropriate to treat the 3 samples as if they were in fact exactly contemporaneous. However, none of these papers concluded that the shroud was not medieval. The first 2 did not attempt to account for the chronological gradient, but Schwalbe and Walsh suggested that a small amount of residual contamination could account for it, making the Oxford sample appear 20 years too old, or the Tucson and Zurich samples 20 years too young. True, Hugh, but as I can show a video clip of you admitting, Schwalbe and Walsh's suggestion could be complete horse trash, and actually the shroud dates to 30 AD, and it was neutron irradiated during Jesus' supernatural resurrection event that you as a Roman Catholic believe actually happened, or should believe actually happened at the very least. So it's an equal possibility at this point, at least given the data you're presenting here. And again, it's not my job to go, I think there is more evidence on the neutron radiation from Bob Rucker, nuclear engineer, and his model being confirmed scientifically by Dr. Thomas McAvoy in the Applied Optics peer-reviewed journal, Science Journal. But outside of that comment, at the very least, you yourself, Hugh, have admitted it's actually equally probable. We don't have a clue whether the shroud is medieval. So these papers, the ones that say it's still medieval, are wrong, even according to you as the ultimate shroud skeptic. We can't prove whether it's medieval and that this chronological gradient is just due to a small amount of residual contamination versus it's due to it's a 30 AD cloth, and the gradient we get, chronological gradient we found in the carbon-14 dates, is due to the supernatural neutron irradiation contamination. this extraordinary form of contamination that was known about back in 1989 in the journal Nature, published by Dr. Thomas Phillips, and then further refined by nuclear engineer Bob Rucker and confirmed by physicist Dr. Tom McAvoy in the Applied Optics Secular Science Journal. Again, I just wanted to make that known for the audience, but it's not my place to assess or something. So yeah, continue on to read Hugh. Encouraged by this, Sue Benford and Joe Marino, and Bob Rucker suggested that the radiocarbon content of the sample area had been so altered that, okay, so you do mention it. I take my criticism back. Okay, had been so altered that a cloth actually dating to the 1st century now appeared to carbon-14 date, not actually date, to the 14th century. The first proposed that the sample was in fact mostly composed of interpolated threads from the 16th century, invisibly incorporated among shreds of the original cloth. And the second, that subatomic particles emitted from the body of Christ during his resurrection had created just the right amount of new radiocarbon to date the shroud to the 14th century. There's currently insufficient evidence for either of these to be considered serious challenges to the medieval date. Now, this is just rubbish. You admitted they are equally probable explanations. They are an empirical equivalence. Science does not favor the medieval date. That's foolish. That's only an anti-supernatural bias, which I assume as a Roman Catholic you don't have. You're not some foolish little atheist who believes in naturalism. So who are you to say, no, the shroud is probably medieval and it was contaminated by residual naturalistic forms of contamination that weren't properly cleaned, versus there was a supernatural resurrection and it neutron irradiated the shroud, for example. There's nothing to privilege your option versus that. They are empirically equivalent. So I just wanted to make that clear. But still, I'm letting my bias get out. I should just be reading Hugh. So I'm just going to finish off just reading, and then I'm going to let Giulio Fonte give the rebuttal to Hugh Farey and see what he says. Okay, so conclusion. The experiments discussed above represent a serious and worthwhile attempt to discover and understand a possible method by which the image on the Turin shroud could have been created in the late Middle Ages. Hugh Farey, am aware that my results are not perfect, but consider that they successfully replicate most of the undisputed characteristics of the shroud image. And in approaching the more disputed aspects, I offer a sensible foundation on which to base further research. The wholesale rejection of Hugh Farey's research based on unfounded or disputed assumptions and misplaced religious conviction is unworthy of serious consideration in a scientific journal. Ooh, scathing words from beloved Hugh Farey here. Ethical statement. The author is a committed and practicing Roman Catholic. He does not consider that the Shroud of Turin has any relevance to his faith. All right, and then here are his references. He provides just 14 references for his paper. Again, that's pretty impressive for a 3-page paper. Now let's switch gears, because Giulio Fonte has a response in the peer-reviewed journal to Hugh Farey's paper here. All right, commentary on the Turin Shroud, a medieval technique. Again, medical and clinical case reports journal. So the same peer-reviewed science journal, medical journal that Giulio and Hugh have all been publishing in. Published on June 30th, 2025. Just a few days ago by Giulio Fonte and Carol Gregorick. Okay, so there's no abstract here, so we just get straight into the paper. First section, premise. The authors, Giulio and Carol, of article number 1, reaffirmed the entirety of their previously published findings, including the assertion that classifying the Turin Shroud as a medieval artifact is epistemologically comparable to asserting that the Earth is flat. They express particular concern regarding the content of article number 2. which they regard as scientifically unsound, primarily due to its selective omission of data and evidence that contradict the conclusions it seeks to advance. All right, so just to find out what A2 is, okay, so these are Giulio Fonte's original peer-reviewed papers, and Hugh Farey, Turin Shroud and Medieval Techniques. So 3 is the paper we just read from Hugh Farey. So he's talking about Hugh there. Okay, so this is article number 2 is Hugh Farey's peer-reviewed paper, which Giulio and Carroll regard to be scientifically unsound, primarily due to its selective omission of data and evidence that contradict the conclusions it seeks to advance. So they're saying Hugh Farey is contradicting himself. He's selectively omitting data, lying by omission, to make his theory look good in his peer-reviewed paper that he submitted and was published. And he's doing this in ways that actually contradict the evidence. So his conclusions and the evidence contradict. Okay, let's get into this. Introduction. So that's the premise Giulio Fonte and Carroll are seeking to prove, I take it, in this paper. Great. Introduction. As it would require at least 100 pages to properly discuss and scientifically clarify all the very disputable sentences contained in Hugh Farey's paper, the authors of the original paper therefore decide to comment on only a few significant examples. One cannot accept results declared as quote-unquote not perfect, or statements such as possible artistic methods have provided a satisfactory proof of concept, if not a definitive answer, because they do not reproduce all the complex characteristics of the Turin Shroud image. Either all the characteristics of the scientifically analyzed body image can be reproduced, or it is not scientifically correct to declare that a non-perfect reproduction has almost achieved the goal. Perhaps the most robust and defamatory criticism that appears among the lines of Hugh Farey's paper is that the authors, Giulio and Carroll, of the original paper, cannot provide a serious and objective scientific judgment on the Turin Shroud because they are deviated from the fact that they, quote-unquote, know that the Turin Shroud is authentic. Albert Einstein affirmed an important concept when he said, quote-unquote, religion without science is blind, but science without religion is lame. Obviously, scientific studies should not influence religion and vice versa. Only at the end of the specific analysis should scientific conclusions be compared with religious ones to detect their compatibility or not. As a notable macroscopic example of scientific findings, and among the many comparisons drawn between empirical evidence and accounts in the Christian Holy Bible, it is observed that, unlike others condemned to crucifixion, Jesus Christ, as represented on the Turin Shroud and traditionally regarded as the king of redemptive suffering, displays distinct signs of a crowning with thorns on the forehead, temples, and nape of the neck. As a microscopic example of scientific results, there is a notable presence of creatinine mixed with the blood, typical of a person who has been severely tortured. In reference to alleged non-scientific claims, one cannot ignore what is reported in the conclusions of Hugh Farey's paper, where he says, quote-unquote, the wholesale rejection of this research based on unfounded or disputed assumptions and misplaced religious conviction is unworthy of serious consideration in a scientific journal. It is clear here that Hugh Farey formulates an attack that is too generic, both in terms of its scientific validity and because it lacks substantiated and verifiable evidence. In the published papers, the authors, Giulio and Carroll, of the first paper, present quantifiable, repeatable, and reproducible scientific evidence that is entirely opposite to that declared by Hugh Farey in his paper. The reviewers have allowed the publication of these results. Examples of criticality. In the summary, we read, unfortunately, Hugh Farey, finds that excessive zeal for an alternate first century explanation by the authors of the first two peer-reviewed papers, Julio and Carroll, has clouded these reviews. Well, the excessive zeal that implicitly indicates an anti-scientific attitude is in the first papers is instead demonstrated by several publications. See, for example, references 6 to 14, which are strangely totally forgotten by Hugh Farey in his paper. In these, it is clear that using 4 independent methods, mechanical, numismatic, and chemical, FTIR and Raman analysis, the Turin Shroud finds a temporal placement around the first century, and therefore in the era in which Jesus Christ lived in Palestine. Rather than objectively presenting the substantial and largely conclusive scientific findings published across numerous peer-reviewed journals, Hugh Farey in his paper risks misleading readers who lack expertise in the subject. Hugh Farey in his paper does so by emphasizing conflicting viewpoints, many of which date back many years and have since been substantially resolved as documented in recent studies. See references 15 to 24 and references 25 and 26. By emphasizing conflicting data without addressing the subsequent scholarly resolutions, the conclusions of Hugh Farey in his paper appear to adopt a biased approach aimed at promoting the misleading notion that little or nothing is definitively known about the Turin Shroud. This rhetorical stratagem leads to an unfounded conclusion that nearly all existing hypotheses remain scientifically valid. Such a position is not supported by credible evidence. On the contrary, publications such as those cited in references 27 through 29 form the foundation for describing the Turin Shroud's scientifically established characteristics, findings that remain indisputable unless and until refuted by new rigorous evidence, not just Hugh's opinions or something like that. We need evidence to refute it. That's what Julio is saying here in this paper response. And all of the references, Julio's papers are usually open access and for free on the internet. So go to the references in the bibliography and you'll be able to get these papers for free and read them. Anyways, Hugh Farey's paper, quote unquote, going on, Julio says, quote unquote, Hugh Farey's paper's statement is misleading when it reads, this author, namely Hugh Farey, who has himself studied all the relevant literature. Hugh Farey evidently ignores or selects not to know, for example, references 27 through 29. It seems evident that Hugh Farey in his paper wants to ignore some results that are unfavorable to his set of goals. Let us consider the example of the presence of blood and iron oxide in addition to other material, in correspondence with the Turin Shroud's blood states. While Hugh Farey insists on highlighting the contrast between Heller and Adler, declared in references 22 and 23 on the presence of blood, and the atheist Walter Macroni declared in references 15 to 21 on the presence of iron oxide, in correspondence with the same red stains, references 25 and 26 clarify the problem by simply explaining that the stains in question are blood also mixed with blood serum that were contaminated over the centuries by the pigments detected by Walter Macroni, following the contact of the Turin Shroud with pictorial copies pressed onto the relic in order to obtain relics of a higher order. And Hugh Farey, this is what he believes too. He doesn't deny. He would say, he is on my show, he says Walter Macroni was full of it, totally wrong, ignorant, foolish, in his foolish opinion that the Shroud bloodstains are composed of paint. Total nonsense, says Hugh Farey. The author of the paper, Hugh, says, no, it's blood. It's blood. Now, he also thinks there's paint there. It was touched up by paint. But it's blood that's there. Macroni was oblivious. And he also disagrees with Walter Macroni on the body images being composed of paint. Total rubbish, says Hugh. No, they were washed away. All the particles had to be washed away, and all that's left is this oxidization of the... So looks like Heller and Adler were right, and Macroni was full of it. Didn't have a clue what he was talking about. And that's according to the ultimate Shroud skeptic, Hugh Farey himself. So yes, Walter McCrone did find particles of pigment, contamination particles and stuff like that. But he was totally wrong when he said, no, it's loaded with it and the images are composed of paint. What we see is paint on the Shroud images. Hugh Farey says, nuh-uh, what are you talking about, McCrone? Those results are bunk, empirically and scientifically speaking. So how did it get published in a credible peer-reviewed journal? Who knows? Someone dropped the ball that day. Anyways, again, trying not to give too much of my commentary, going back to reading what the authors say. So Julio and Carol say, quote unquote, another example of a misleading statement is found in the introduction of Hugh Farey's paper, where it is written that the Turin Shroud was reliably radiocarbon dated. Incalculable scientific articles convincingly question this dating. See references 6 to 14 in the bibliography. With these inaccurate statements, it appears that Hugh Farey in his paper is subtly leading the reader drop by drop to the predefined conclusion that Hugh Farey wants to argue for. The introduction also states possible artistic methods have provided a satisfactory proofs of concept, if not an answer. But it does not appear at all that an artistic method capable of reproducing all the very particular physical chemical characteristics of the body image on the Turin Shroud has been described at all. Also noteworthy is the following statement in Hugh Farey's paper, quote unquote, his suspicion that my destiny is to be suffering in hell. This interpretation, however, misrepresents the actual wording found in reference 30, which states, through the evidence of the Turin Shroud, we can help bring other doubters to Christ to avoid a destiny of suffering in hell. This statement clearly conveys a general theological reflection that the numerous evidential features of the Turin Shroud may assist individuals in their spiritual journey, potentially guiding them forward toward faith in Christ and thereby salvation, understood as liberation from eternal suffering and the affirmation of resurrection and eternal life. Hugh Farey in his paper, mistakenly finds a contradiction in Julio and Carol's previous peer-reviewed papers, writing, quote unquote, there is no apparent connection between the two images in terms of color transmitted through or between the threads. However, this seems to be contradicted by his own observation of reference 27 regarding the interstices between the threads, that the colored fibers of the main image continue deep into the interstices between the threads. Hugh Farey does not understand that while the cited publications refer to the interstices observed along the plane formed by the two major directions of the fabric, the author of A2 of Hugh Farey's paper, namely Hugh Farey, mistakenly considers the interstices along the thickness of the fabric. So this is Julio saying Hugh Farey totally bungled this. He didn't have a clue what he was saying. Continue on, quote unquote, this is noted only to highlight a further failure by the author, Hugh Farey, of his peer-reviewed paper, who silently tries to hide the complete and utter failure of his hypothesis of image formation, initially highlighted by the studies of Ray Rogers, reference 1, in their original papers, A1, observes that in the Turin Shroud, there's a fact E10. There is no cementation between fibers or signs of capillary flow in the image areas. And then it comments in reference to the hypothesis of Hugh Farey that evidence E10, cementation, although not frequent, contrarily to the Turin Shroud image, is found above all in the areas of more intense color. In fact, one of the main problems in the impossibility of reproducing the Turin Shroud image concerns the fact that tempera-type colors cause production of additional substances on the fibers, and also inevitable cementation between fibers that make the experimental result completely different from the result which we observe on the Turin Shroud. See figure 1 with these colored images. Oops, that's a little, you can see that. Figure 1, examples of additional unevenly distributed material on linen fibers colored using egg tempera in the experiment proposed by Hugh Farey in his paper. These are from Hugh Farey's results directly. utter failure. And that's why even Hugh Farey has to admit the science, empirical observations, his method sucked. It failed. Utter failure. But Hugh Farey has a non-proven, non-empirically evidenced, no observations supporting this. He has this ad hoc supposition. Oh well, if I just perform the experiments, tweaked this, less egg yolk, more vinegar, perhaps. Maybe if I did it dancing around in a pink tutu, then it would work. Then I would reproduce the Shroud images properly. Again, the jokes aside, I really think this is the failure of your paper, Hugh, and I think that both Hugh's paper, peer-reviewed paper, and Julio's response paper here would be so much better if you advance the science, Hugh. If you actually did experiments, tweaking your method, and then giving us the observations. Okay, what do I do when I use less egg yolk? What happens when I use more vinegar? What happens? Does it work? Does it do what I say it's going to do? Right now, we just have your word for it, and that's not good enough. That's not science. You could have progressed the conversation. Then we could have had Julio responding to those direct observations and observational science instead of, kind of tit for tats. Could have been a lot better if Hugh had done some actual science for his peer-reviewed paper. I'm a little surprised that you didn't do that. And instead, for your first, as far as I know, this is your first peer-reviewed paper in a science journal, in a medical journal, a professional science journal. And instead of bringing observations to help progress the conversation forward, you preferred to call out Julio Fonte for quoting a YouTube comment calling you a snake in the grass. Fair enough, but it could have been so much better for me, the fans, for people wanting to engage in Shroud science and get to the bottom of this, get to the truth. This could have advanced the discussion further, but unfortunately it didn't. Julio goes on, lastly but not least, in the observation that Hugh Farey contained in his paper contains incorrect information that could be misleading to readers. Here we limit ourselves to just two examples. Hugh Farey in his paper claims to have studied the photographs of the Turin Shroud taken in 1988. There were no official photographs taken in that year. In addition to the photographs taken by Alta Definizione in 2008, the most recent official photographs are those taken by Gian Durante in 2000 and 2002. As previously noted, Hugh Farey in his paper claims or gives the impression that he has thoroughly, quote-unquote, studied all the relevant literature on the Turin Shroud. However, it omits several key publications that document the selective presence of high radioactivity of the Turin Shroud, namely see references 5, 30, and 31 in the bibliography to this paper. This omission is significant, as such findings alone have the potential to fundamentally challenge and invalidate the 1988 radiocarbon dating results that concluded a medieval origin for the Turin Shroud. While several criticisms have been directed at the content of Hugh Farey and his paper, one final acknowledgement of merit is warranted. In the conclusions and in reference to the image formation hypothesis, the author, Julio Fonte and Carroll, candidly concedes. The author, Hugh Farey, the author of A2, candidly concedes the author is aware that his results are not perfect, a rare moment of intellectual honesty following numerous highly questionable claims. This admission effectively underscores the continuing inability to replicate the body image on the Turin Shroud, with all of its unique and complex characteristics. As such, the Turin Shroud image remains, to date, scientifically irreproducible, and its formation mechanism unexplained within the current framework of scientific understanding. Acknowledgements, many thanks to Teddy Pappas of the Shroud Science Group, who furnished useful advice. And then you go into Julio Fonte and Carroll's Gregoric's references. It's a short 3-page paper. They've got 31 scholarly references cited in their paper, whereas Hugh only had 14. Again, for 3 pages, I think They both cite enough of the literature, but it's just interesting. Yep, Giulio Fonte is citing more, 31 scholarly sources undergirding his paper. So yeah, that's it. That's the update for panel review part 16E on Hugh Farey's image forming hypothesis, the Quem Queritas hypothesis, scientifically speaking. And now I will move on to the next aspect that I want to cover, my take where on Shroud's blog, Hugh Farey's Shroud blog called Bayesian Balderdash. This is a comment directly about me and references me. So yeah, I just want to give some quick feedback on it. Okay, so let's move on to the next aspect here, refuting Hugh Farey, the ultimate Shroud skeptic's new blog called Bayesian Balderdash. Let's take a look at that. So here's the blog, Bayesian Balderdash. What does Hugh Farey have to say here? He says, a post or two ago, I suggested that people giving presentations of the authenticist view of the Shroud should avoid the use of Bayesian statistics, which, although are actually quite useful predictive calculations based on prior factual knowledge, are often badly misrepresented as accurate derivations of probability based on nothing more than guesses. This was very forcefully expostulated against by Dale Glover in a subsequent podcast of his own, who assumed I was thinking of him and called me clueless, profoundly ignorant, and out of my league. Oh dear, dangerous words. Not really. I think they were extremely accurate, especially given the information I had at the time. I will admit this, I was wrong. So apparently, Hugh says, I wasn't thinking of Dale Glover, as it happens, as although he has performed some such Bayesian manipulations regarding the resurrection of Christ, I don't recall that he has done the same regarding the Shroud. I was thinking of Giulio Fonte, whose analysis is published at shroud.com. Let me just show that. Okay, so a probabilistic model to quantify the results of research on the Turing Shroud. And also by Tom Dallas, who presented his ideas in a discussion with Guy Powell on YouTube. So here's Tom Dallas giving his Bayesian assessment. I haven't seen this interview, so that will be interesting to take a look at. Back to Hugh Farey. So, okay, it does look like I messed up. My apologies, Hugh. It really looked like you had me in mind here in terms of what you were saying, but it appears I made a false assumption. So, yeah, my apologies on that front. That said, like you say, if the cat fits, and it does because I do employ Bayesian statistics, and it's true, I have not used Bayes' theorem for my assessment of the Shroud of Turin, though I have appealed to the use of subjective probabilities reflecting my personal degree of warrantedness or warranted-ishness. And I can get into what I mean by that in a moment, but I haven't used Bayes' theorem with respect to the resurrection of Christ either. I didn't need it. And the reason is because the way I use Bayes' theorem is just to get the cumulative overall probability when I have multiple pieces of evidence. So with the resurrection of Christ, I assume you mean the historical evidence, like the probability that the resurrection hypothesis is true given the historical evidence. I didn't use Bayes for that, actually, because I only had one argument. I didn't need a cumulative case. It was only actually, that's a lie. I did use Bayes on that because there was two arguments from the appearance to the 12. There was one where it violated the social dynamics of hallucinations individually. And then secondly, through a mundane appearance of Jesus, not a glorious resurrection appearance of Jesus. And then I had the group appearance, collective hallucination hypothesis as a failure. And all the other naturalistic things failed and stuff like that. So I had two arguments on a balanced probability. So I did use Bayes there. You're correct. But mostly I did use Bayes' theorem for the hypothesis Christianity is true. And on that front, I had evidence from the miraculous images on the Shroud, the historical evidence of the resurrection, the vindication prediction argument, and also the inner witness of the Holy Spirit via producing properly basic beliefs. Okay, so just reading on, Hugh continues. Anyway, the rest of this little comment is based on all these worthy opponents being absolutely correct. Thank you, Hugh. I was absolutely correct. on my debasing myself in humble apology and submitting exactly as directed by their expertise, the following Bayesian analysis of my own. Excellent, excellent. Now your brain's functioning, Hugh. I love it. Uh, no, but this is a good exercise. So great. So Hugh gives his thing. He says the prior probability is 50%. Excellent. Because there are two hypotheses. Either the shroud is medieval or the shroud is authentic, meaning dating to Jesus Christ. No, actually, I'm not sure it is that simple in terms of the prior probability, because what about David Falk? He has the hypothesis that it's not medieval, that it's a Byzantine fake relic. It's a Byzantine artifact, maybe from the 10th century or something like that. So that it's not quite as simple. If you want it in 50-50 terms, you have to say the shroud's either authentic, or in the sense of, I guess you're meaning in the historical authenticity sense here, in terms of having covered the historical Jesus, or it's not. And that would be 50%, because that would cover a Byzantine fake, a Dark Age fake, a medieval fake, a Renaissance fake, if that's possible, with Picnet and Prince. So that's the way you would state this. That basically, hypothesis one is false, as a matter of fact. That would be the not H part of Bayes, not what you've put here, because it's not just either it dates to 30 AD or it's medieval. Those aren't the only two options. So you've screwed up your Bayesian assessment there. I guess I was right. You were clueless, profoundly ignorant, and out of your league. Okay, no, I'm not going to go after you too hard here, because I applaud you that, hey, you're using Bayes and starting to experiment with it. That's a good thing. Now, you provide the following evidences, direct evidences to define, right? With your prior at 50%, you've got the radiocarbon dating proves the shroud is medieval, and you say you're 99% convinced of that, and 1% convinced that maybe it's authentic and not medieval on that basis. Then you have the Darcy Memorandum. From the 1389 Darcy Memorandum, you say 95% convinced this evidence proves the shroud is medieval, and you're 10% convinced that it could be explained away through ignorance or dishonesty or something like that. Walter McCrone's ochre findings, you're 95% that proves the shroud's medieval, and then 5% convinced. And finally, you've got the textile expert findings, the four-shaft treadle-loom skeptical argument. You give a 90% proven that the shroud is medieval is high, and 30% that maybe it is authentic, even given these four-shaft treadle-looms. And then on that basis, you do your little calculations, plugging it in to the formula, and you come up with, 99.998% probability that the shroud is medieval. And you think, hey, I've got him. Doesn't that prove using Bayes is a bunch of BS? You got beloved Danny Boy Porter saying that this blog, according to AI, is a great piece of satire. Well, I would agree. Look, Hugh, this is a great piece of satire in illustrating Hugh's point, right? He thinks his point is that it's all just a bunch of made-up numbers and they don't mean nothing. The problem is his point is stupid. His point is wrong, dumb, foolish, because his numbers are nonsense does not mean that my numbers are nonsense or that others are. And I can go through this and prove his numbers are total rubbish. Let's go through it, right? So what would be the problem, right? Because, well, once again, with the prior probabilities, I already raised the objection there. He doesn't even understand what the prior probabilities are. The prior probability that H is true, that whatever your hypothesis is, in this case, that his shroud is historically authentic. It covered Jesus in 30 AD or 33 AD, whatever date you go for it. And then the not H. No, it's false. As a matter of fact, false that the shroud is historically authentic. Instead, he puts, well, it's either medieval or it dates to 30 AD. That's a false dichotomy. That's wrong. That's a false Bayesian assessment, because what if David Falk is right? So that's the first critique, where Hugh doesn't know how to use Bayes properly here. Secondly, another main thing, look at all the evidences he gives. Does anyone detect a little bit of bias here? They're all skeptical nonsense. It's all skeptics' arguments, which is fine. I would consider these negative. If the hypothesis is the shroud is authentic, these would be negative evidences. And with the exception of evidence number 3, I would argue all of these need to be considered, kind of thing. And maybe evidence 3 could be considered as well in a sense, but look, all he includes are the 4 skeptical supporting evidences. But this is an incomplete Bayesian assessment, because the point of Bayes is that you look at all the evidences you're privy to, right? So maybe Hugh's saying, yeah, but subjectively speaking, I'm just an ignoramus, and I've never heard of any positive arguments for the shroud. Obviously, that's not true. He's written blog after blog on all the evidences and why he thinks they fail, and stuff like that. But surely, given his assessment here, he would think that some of them have at least a 1% probability or something like that, right? So the fact that he's not including any of the positive evidences is very suspicious. His conclusion is not based on the total positive and negative evidences like the way I use with Bayes' theorem proper. So right there, I would say Hugh's number, this final number, 99%, is unreasonable because it's so biased, based on subjective bias, not what a reasonable real seeker would base their arguments on. They would base it on the total evidence, which would include positive and the negative evidences, not just the negative evidences supporting that the hypothesis is false and that the shroud is not authentic, aka, as Hugh puts it, medieval, because he assumes if it's not authentic, it's got to be medieval then, right? That's the only date a non-authentic relic could date from, according to Hugh Farey, or at least the non-authentic Shroud of Turin anyways. So that's the next step. You've got to include the total evidences, and because you're not doing so, your numbers are unreasonable. A reasonable person, which is a semi-objective standard, would know better. They would know, well, hey, I've done a little research, and there's this thing called the Sudarium of Oviedo, the Hungarian Prey Codex. There's textile evidences that support the antiquity of the shroud. There are other arguments supporting the antiquity of the shroud, the authenticity of the shroud, and I've got to consider those. So because your calculation excludes that, you're unreasonable and can be simply dismissed as nonsense. Next, let's look at the problems with each of your 4 evidences specifically. So the radiocarbon dating, really 99%. This shocks me, to be honest, and we'll find out why when I get to evidence 4. But look, you say you're 99% certain the carbon-14 dating proves the shroud is medieval or not authentic. Proven beyond all reasonable doubt. Well, that's funny because that's not what you said when you were on my show, Shroud Panel Review Part 1 with Bob Rucker, where you thought it was more probable, but you never said it's proven. You never said Bob Rucker's unreasonable with his neutron irradiation. There's only a 1% chance that that's true. And again, you don't have an anti-supernatural bias. You're a Roman Catholic. So, what are you saying? That's the only way I would think you could get like a 0 to 1% or something like that if you are assuming naturalism. But neutron irradiation is just, Bob Rucker is just unreasonable. Funny, because that's not what you said in the actual shows. Let's play that clip. Bob has been clear that, look, this aspect should destroy your confidence. You should be, at the very least, agnostic, or he's presented through his mechanism, you should believe that the shroud is not medieval on the basis of the carbon-14 results. Hugh, I want to get from you. So are you saying that what Bob is saying here is kind of an equally probable explanation? Should we be agnostic?
No, Bob's explanation fits the data, which I think is fine. And he's right. It does account for other ideas, not at least, or it can do, and 4 possible ideas. And it is testable. So in that sense, it's a thoroughly commendable hypothesis. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, I don't find, on the basis of other evidence regarding the shroud, that it's likely, and I think it's more likely to be a bit of residual contamination, and would pursue that. And I suppose we will find out eventually when various bits are studied at more detail. Either the rice sample, if any bits of it are still available, would show the gradient moving away. But I think it should be studied in terms of the contamination that's on it, and whether the application of ether as part of the cleaning agent and all that sort of thing can affect the radiocarbon content of various bits of the cloth. And from Bob's point of view, you just need to grab a tiny thread from anywhere in the middle of the shroud, and it'll date far into the future. And that would be a good way of discriminating between our two hypotheses.
Okay, so right there you can see Hughes said back then, when he's being more rational, a reasonable person, and thinking about his actual degree of warrant, when he's asked the question thoughtfully, he says he thinks it's the natural explanation is more likely relative to Bob Rucker, but it's certainly a reasonable doubt. There's at least more than 5%, according to Hugh. He just says it's more likely, 51% or more on the preponderance of evidence. That's what Hugh is saying when he's thoughtful. So clearly here, he's not being a reasonable real seeker. He's not the semi-objective legal standard of a reasonable person. What the average person with average intelligence, average wisdom, discernment, average knowledge base, etc., ought to believe. Again, the reasonable person test is a semi-objective standard. It's an ideal in the court system. It says what a reasonable person ought to conclude, not necessarily what an otherwise reasonable person in fact does include. It could be all reasonable persons, they're reasonable in every sense, with respect to the sky, they just decide to be unreasonable one day and they all believe it's red or something like that. So it's not a head count. I've seen Hugh and his other blogs make this mistake that, well, because people disagree, or maybe you can point to a reasonable person who disagrees and stuff like that, and that someone who's otherwise, generally speaking, reasonable, and because they disagree, that proves that it's not proven beyond all reasonable doubt or something like that. No, that the reasonable person's test is a semi-objective standard used in the court system, and it says if you're a reasonable person, what you ought to conclude in this specific situation. And this is clearly not reasonable. This doesn't reflect what Hugh was actually saying on the show with Bob Rucker there. He doesn't believe there's only a 1% probability. That's ridiculous. In fact, I would say he has no right to say it's more likely. On what basis? An anti-supernatural bias? And like I said, Tom McAvoy's findings actually make it more likely that Bob neutron radiation is. So again, I wouldn't say Tom McAvoy's findings prove beyond all reasonable doubt or something, but I would say it's above 50%, and his natural contamination is below 50%. Maybe in the high 30s to 40 percentile range is where I would put this. If I'm saying, where am I warranted giving it serious consideration? It looks like what Hugh is doing here, and from beloved Danny Boy in the comments, it looks like this is just a piece of satire, and Hugh is making up stuff that's not realistic, not reasonable numbers, to try and make the point that, Bayesian probabilities don't work, because there's garbage in, garbage out. When we're looking at radiocarbon dating, in isolation here as the piece of evidence for the hypothesis, or against the hypothesis that it's false, the Shroud's historically authentic. You have to be a reasonable person, and Hugh's not doing that. And he's just trying to make a point by pretending he says Bob Rucker's an unreasonable fool. That literally contradicts everything he's ever said, including in that clip. He's always said, no, neutron radiation, Bob's hypothesis is eminently reasonable. That means there's at least, under my definition, there's at least a 5% probability. And like I said, the evidence, I think, makes it, if you're being a reasonable seeker, just on the radiocarbon datings, it's more likely Bob's hypothesis is correct. Maybe in the high 50s to low 60s percents, based on Thomas McAvoy's findings at the very least. And again, or higher. But yeah, it's the opposite of what Hugh is saying here. And think about it. Hugh said that the radiocarbon dating findings are more likely Why? Because he thinks that natural contamination is more probably true. Does he have some direct reason for this or some evidence that proves this is factually the case? No, he's got nothing. He says it's on the basis of other things, like these other evidences here. But you can't assume that when you're doing evaluating your Bayes factor for the radiocarbon in isolation, you can't take into effect the other three evidences. You've got to do each Bayes factor independently. So he can't even rely on thinking that it's more likely 51% or more, because he's basically equal. He said it's 50-50. We have no way to tell that. So this should be 50-50. The radiocarbon dating, according to Hugh Farey, and it being consistent, not just trying to prove a satirical point, being a reasonable real seeker and saying, objectively what your degree of warrant is, I believe Hugh has to say it's 50-50. Radiocarbon datings are garbage. And I would disagree with Hugh on that. I would say, well, actually, because of Tom McAvoy's findings, we can say Bob's more probable than not. It's more likely relative to random natural contamination at one of the labs. All right, what about the Darcy memorandum? Well, this one I had to laugh. Darcy, okay, so Hugh says in 1389, Pierre Darcy, Bishop of Troyes, wrote a memorandum to anti-Pope Clement VII, stating that the shroud exhibited in Liry, France, was a cunningly painted fake, and that the artist had confessed neither the Pope nor the owner of the shroud claimed that the shroud was authentic for 100 years after its emergence at Liry, and every exhibition was accompanied by a formal declaration that it wasn't. The probability of this evidence being worthwhile if the shroud were actually authentic depends on whether the bishop and pope knew what they were talking about. So this shocks me. Again, the math's wrong, 95, so it's more than 100%. Okay, fine. Depends how you're using those probabilities. I use it more simplistically, where 100% is the total. But anyway, so ignorance and dishonesty could play a part. Only 10%. Okay, and the probability that it's medieval is 95%, given the Darcy memorandum. Okay, great. These are Hugh's subjective numbers. Now, is Hugh just trying to prove a point in satire, or are these his actual degrees of warrant? Is he, objectively speaking, a reasonable real seeker in assigning these values? I would say he's not being a reasonable real seeker. He's outside of the reasonableness range if these values are accurate displays of his degree of warrant, and not just him trying to play a satirical game to prove a point and try to pretend like, see, we just willy-nilly guess at probabilities. They mean nothing. They're irrelevant. No, we present objective reasons behind our degrees of credence, our degrees of warrant, as displayed here. And look, the first thing, let me play a couple of clips of Hugh Farey admitting this evidence is just garbage and proves nothing. Here's a clip of him in a debate with Dr. Cheryl White, saying that he doesn't even bother using the memorandum. And then, oh boy, his debates with Jack Marquardt, where he gets trounced.
From a historical point of view, no, I'd like to ignore the Darcy memorandum. I'd like to pretend it didn't happen, that the bloke who wrote it didn't exist, and if he did, he didn't send it, and all the rest of it. What I will go straight to is the papal bull of Clement VII, who said, if this shroud is going to be displayed, it must be announced in a loud voice that it is not the burial shroud of Christ. First reference we have to the shroud in France is a bull by Clement VII, dated June 1389, in which he requests that the object, which is a representation of the shroud, may be exhibited, but it must be exhibited under the proviso that it is announced in a loud, clear voice that it is not the shroud of our Lord. Then, as far as I can see, if that was in June, it's generally thought that Darcy wrote his memorandum towards the end of 1389 or the beginning of 1390. So Clement made all his instructions before Darcy wrote the memorandum. So it's not particularly relevant to Clement's instructions whether Darcy sent his memorandum or not. There is some doubt about whether he was in a rage and rashly, got it all copied out and then thought better of it and decided not to send it at all. Doesn't really matter.
Authenticists are kind of in this corner, and I think their story would be a lot better if they would just kind of forget about the Darcy memorandum, because the Darcy memorandum doesn't really make a lot of historical sense given what the historical circumstances are at the time. I could buy it myself personally if the story was that, and you'll probably use this in the future, but if the story was that Geoffrey got busy with the war after 1354, and that's when the dean kind of took over, and he had those exhibitions in Geoffrey's absence. But what would kill that, why you can't go there, I think, is because then if Bishop Darcy got upset about it over that period of time, he wouldn't be writing that letter of praise at the end of May. So it's kind of a conundrum that I think that non-authenticists have about the very beginning of the history of the Shroud, when they finally admit the Shroud exists, that authenticists don't have. Our story is rather simple. You know, we used to have a show here in the United States. It was called The Tonight Show way back when. And Johnny Carson would always say, if you buy the premise, you'll buy the bit. And there's just a false premise here. If you buy the authenticist premise that Geoffrey de Charnay is the owner of the Shroud, got his church ready for exhibitions, and was ready to go in 1354, and the exhibitions took place over the next couple years, and there were no problems with them, and that's why the Bishop Henry praised them, praised Geoffrey, and praised the cult that was going on. This all makes historical sense, but it kind of then puts, and when I say puts the lie to the Darcy memorandum, I'm not trying to indicate that Darcy lied necessarily. I just think it was a bunch of poor information that he had, that now that we're studying it, it just doesn't make very much sense in historical context.
Yeah, you make some good points.
See, I think this just exposes the lie. That you, as a reasonable real seeker, you would not assign 95% to the Darcy memorandum. In fact, you were eager to dismiss it as who cares? It sucks as evidence. It's not good enough. For you, the evidence is this papal bull of Clement, which, once again, on that front, wouldn't be 95% either, because Jack raises reasonable objections, and you guys go to debate, and I think he trounces you in those debates with his level of historical knowledge on my Shroud Wars panel review part 2B, where you and Jack are going and debating these medieval documents. But the Darcy memorandum, in your own words, 95%? No, when you're giving a serious thing, you admit that it sucks. No, it shouldn't even be used as evidence by skeptics at all. You would prefer to use the bull of Clement, the anti-pope, and stuff like that. So why are you going to this is not a real thing. The Pope had zero scientific knowledge. He had no idea whether it was a representation or not. And since you got rid of you yourself admit the Darcy memorandum is garbage and rubbish, without that, you have no historical evidence for saying there was an official inquiry or the artist admitted to painting the Shroud. The Pope, anti-Pope Clement VII, who is the historical document you prefer to use, knew bubkiss. He knew jack shiite about, he was totally ignorant as to whether the Shroud was authentic or not. He had no evidence. And it looks like the Pope is dishonest because he's waffling, going back and forth. He's playing politics. So maybe Pierre Darcy, for the sake of argument, is all sweet and innocent, and he's just bumbled up well, let's face it, he was dishonest because he misrepresented his predecessor. There was no inquiry, and we have a letter from his predecessor contradicting him. So I would say the evidence favors that he was dishonest there. It's much higher than 10 to 20%, or the 10% that you give. The Pope was also dishonest. You know, he's just, I'm playing politics, like, I'm getting caught in this controversy. Okay, call it a representative. Why does he support it? Waffle back and forth between supporting it and not supporting it being exhibited in Leary. The historical documents give us a mixed bag. It's not this clear, we know it's a fake, we've examined it, it's a fake, don't just call it a representation, and that's it. No. And it's interesting because Jack Marquardt provides a plausible historical hypothesis explaining exactly why there was this waffling, because there was a time when the Roman Catholic Church was going to reunify with the Eastern Orthodox Church.
In September 1259, the Greeks, who have been out of power now for more than 50 years, they bring an army to Pelagonia and they win. They beat the Latins. And Pelagonia is not that far from Constantinople. And so Baldwin says, my days are numbered. I know I'm going to be out of here, but this is my last chance to free my son. I mean, if I don't have the money as emperor, what am I going to do? So what would Baldwin do? What's he always done? It's cousin Louis, where are you when I need you, right? So he contacts Louis, and Louis agrees to pay Philip's ransom. Now, in this theory, for Louis to pay this ransom, he's got to get something back in return. And the only thing that Baldwin still has is the Shroud of Turin. And so Baldwin transfers the Shroud of Turin to Louis. This should be no surprise. In fact, if you think about Occam's razor, among competing theories, the theories with the least assumptions is the most believable. And there's no assumption to be made here. Louis is a collector of Byzantine relics, and if he got the shroud, he'd put it in the Sainte-Chapelle chapel, and he'd be very happy. It's probably not worth monetarily what he's going to pay for the ransom, but he is getting his cousin's son out and doing the decent thing too. But I really believe that Louis thought that when he did this transaction, it was really nothing different than he did before, because he had a cousin relative emperor who couldn't be trusted with relics. And if he didn't do something, he'd probably sell the relic to somebody else. But the medieval church is not that forgiving. It doesn't go with what is in somebody's mind. It goes in the way that the transaction is structured. And in all the other relic loans, the relics were pledged, there was a default on the loan, and the impious lenders were going to take the relic. There was no lender here. Louis paid a ransom, and he got a relic. So he paid money for a relic. And that is how I think the Shroud of Turin got out of Constantinople, and Louis brought it to Paris. But I believe that before he took the next step, he got the advice of churchmen, a canon lawyer, someone who knew what was going on, and said to Louis, what you just did was the mortal sin of simony. Any way you look at it, you paid cash, and in return, you got a relic. And if you make this disclosure, if the Shroud of Turin is put into the Sainte-Chapelle chapel, everyone's going to ask, where did you get it? How did you get it? And you're going to have a problem with simony, and you're going to have a problem with the church. So we go to the second question, is the simony theory convincing? And we'll go to the four factors that I mentioned earlier today. Approach. In the approach, this is based on text, just like the Sainte-Chapelle theory, and adopts no fictions. So it's a perfect approach. Fit. It explains why the shroud's not mentioned during the missing years. It explains the silence of the church and Geoffrey about provenance, which we'll talk about in the next paper. But you can see why they wouldn't want to talk about where the relic had been. And it fits Geoffrey's plan. In 1343, he's in possession of the relic. The evidence is Louis' past relic dealings with Baldwin, Louis' ransom of Philip. And if I didn't mention it before, when Philip was released, he went into the service of Louis. He gets out and he's working now for Louis. And there is no doubt that Geoffrey de Charnay is Joinville's grandson. And by the way, that's only been known since about 1996, when Cowper and Kennedy wrote a book on Geoffrey de Charnay about his chivalry. They disclosed that his grandfather was John de Joinville. And when Wilson came out with his book in 1998, The Blood in the Shroud, he said, I didn't realize this before, that there was this relationship. But then that was it. There was no further follow-up with that. Why did Pope Innocent VI go through all this rigmarole? Why did he conceal the authenticity of the shroud? I don't know if you've heard about the Great Schism, but the Eastern Church was divided from the Western Church. And it goes way back to 1054. It mainly had problems about papal primacy. And then after the Crusaders threw all the Greek clergy out of Constantinople, it was almost an irreparable type breach. At that time, and I have it in my paper and I have it in the slides, but I'm going to kind of quickly go through this. Church unification, this is how the church was split up in those days. Along comes this emperor. His mother was Anna of Savoy, a Roman Catholic. So he was an Eastern emperor and had to officially stay with the Orthodox Church, but he was a Catholic in every sense of the word. In fact, about 15 years after the Lyrae exhibitions, he went to Rome and became a Catholic. So the Pope Innocent VI, who we talked about, he was working along with Emperor John V, and he had a realistic chance to get the church put back together. But what was going to happen if he said, the Turin Shroud is an authentic relic, and I know it's an authentic relic because it can be traced back to Constantinople? The emperor would say, give us back our relic. And at that point, he would have a quandary. If he gave him back the relic, he'd be sending the relic into a war zone. That's why they were asking for military help in the first place from the Pope. And if he refused the emperor would say, I'm not going to be involved in church unification. So he came up with what I think was a rather ingenious plan to protect the relic, keep church unification going. And that was, he said, you can have your exhibitions, you can call it authentic, but I'm not putting out a papal bull, because that's going to, you'll just look like you're renegades out in Lyrae, but I'm not going to approve it. And I think that is what happened. And I think there was another reason for the church's silence and for the imposition of perpetual silence. And that is, Geoffrey told him what had happened in terms of the St. Louis purchase. And there is no way that the Pope could say, this is authentic, and we're going to trace it back. And it went to Louis, because now, where are the popes sitting? In Avignon. They're virtually captive to the French and the French church, and they're not going to take the greatest saint that they've just declared and say he committed simony. So I think that the decision was made by the papacy, give the relic, accord the relic the honor it deserves. Let's not get the Byzantines upset about things, and we will not then have to disclose the simony of St. Louis. Bishop Darcy is the fly in the ointment, because he starts screaming that the shroud is fraudulent, so he sentences him to perpetual silence so that providence doesn't come up. And then he issues 3 inconsistent bulls. The first one allows the Lyrae clergy to say anything they want, and they do say it's authentic. The second one probably comes after the Byzantine emperor says, I want my shroud back, and then he tells the clergy in Lyrae, don't call it authentic, call it a copy. And then in the following June, he drops all of those requirements, and they can do anything they want again. Now, what happened? A historian would ask. In April, between the second bull and the third bull, the emperor is overthrown. They don't have John anymore. You don't have a Catholic emperor. There goes church unification. So there's no reason to do this. So Pope Clement VII continues to conceal the authenticity of the shroud for the exact and precise reasons that Innocent did. Now, the one question, I really am very close to the end. The one question is, so he's allowing them to call it authentic in the exhibitions. Why doesn't he just call it authentic? And the reason is what I explained before. I don't think they cared about the Byzantine connection or the shroud going back to Byzantium, But you just can't come out and say it used to be a Byzantine relic and not say what happened to it in the meantime. He would have had to reveal that the King Saint of France obtained the relic through a purchase, which would be simony. So I think he just let it go. And that's why all these things that are mysteries about the two exhibitions really aren't mysteries if you understand the history that's behind it.
That's equally probable. I would say that's at the very least an equally probable and plausible historical hypothesis to explain the data. It should be 50-50 on the Clement's bull, which again, you don't include here. The Darcy Memorandum, you yourself admit is garbage. So that these are not reasonable probability values representing your real degree of warrant. You're contradicting yourself in the videos. You're making stuff up to make this satirical point that, oh, guess anything goes, as though like probability, when you use Bayes' theorem, people are just mindlessly guessing and making up values to suit their own interests. No, the credences, the values we're giving, the probability values, represent our sincere degrees of credences or justification or warrant given the objective reasons and evidence in favor of those percent values that we're giving. It's not just, oh, I'm feeling 95% today, or I'm feeling 10% today. It's not a guesstimate. It's not just random or feelings or emotions. That's what you have to understand. It's based on the value of warrant or warrantedishness. Again, if you want to know what I mean there, it's a complex debate in philosophy between permissivism and the uniqueness thesis. And I have a view that's both. Basically, I go for a view called the theistic uniqueness thesis, which says there's only 1% value that's warranted. So what would God be? Pretending God was limited. Obviously, he's omniscient, so he has 100% degree of warrant in everything he knows in a properly basic way. But there is the hypothetical, okay, let's pretend God is limited in his knowledge to what Hugh Farey knows, and he just knows these 4 things, presenting all the info that Hugh Farey has. The only warranted value would be, okay, if God was in that situation, he would assign 75%. Let's just say that's the only value that's warranted. But I think that we are permitted, God permits us within the reasonableness range. He constrains the effects of sin on our noetic and cognitive faculties to allow us to be warranted-ish. So maybe I would get 70%. So I'm not warranted, technically speaking, but I am warranted-ish. God has restrained the effects of sin enough for me as a reasonable real seeker to be like, yeah, I've got a degree of knowledge here. I'm warranted-ish, technically speaking, or in a looser sense, just warranted. I'm within this reasonableness range kind of thing. Whereas the numbers they're not even within the reasonableness range. This is, if it's real, accurately reflecting what you think then I think you're just nuts and you've lost your mind. You're totally unreasonable, let's say that. But secondly, we know you're just lying here. This isn't true because, as we saw in the clips, you think the Darcy Memorandum is garbage and rubbish evidence. Throw it in the garbage. You prefer to look at the papal bull. All right, Walter McCrone's ochre findings. In 1990, in the well-respected peer-reviewed journal Accounts of Chemical Research, Walter McCrone, of course, he doesn't mention his own journal papers where he published most of his results in because that's complete rubbish. But he described finding red ochre and vermilion on the shroud, consistent with it being a medieval painting. The probability of this, if the shroud were actually authentic, is minimal, although it could have been touched up. I'll give this 5%. That's ridiculous. That's unreasonable, Hugh. And the probability of this evidence of the shroud being medieval is 95%. Really? What? First of all, that just doesn't follow. It's totally unreasonable. Why couldn't it be? Let's pretend it is a painting, and Walter McCrone's correct here for a second. Why couldn't it be a Dark Age painting? Why couldn't it date to the 600s AD or the 700s AD? Like, just because it's a painting and Walter McCrone found that the shroud images were composed of paint, nothing about that proves it's medieval. unless you're saying red ochre didn't exist, which is funny because I remember reading Walter Macrone's book saying it dates back 26,000 years on cave paintings and stuff like that. They were finger in the version of finger paintings and stuff. So obviously this isn't true. And the fact of the matter is, Hugh Farey himself contradicts this nonsense all the time. He contradicts Walter Macrone. Walter Macrone was full of it. He said that the images were composed of these pigments. That's how you see it, is the pigments. And Hugh Farey says, nah, I agree with Stirp, the credible Stirp scientist, not the farce of a scientist, the incompetent, ignorant, and foolish Walter Macrone, biased by his atheism. That's nonsense. No, the paint's obviously gone. It's been washed away. It's eroded away. And what we see as the images is oxidized dehydrated cellulose caused by some kind of acid in the vinegar in the paint or whatever it is in this ochre pigment. So even this is just unreasonable. Even you admit there's a 0% probability that Walter Macrone is correct about his ochre findings. And even if he was correct, that doesn't prove it's medieval. So yeah, this would be 0%, I'm sorry to say. What about it? Okay, what about if there's pigment and our hypothesis is that it's historically authentic and covered Jesus as his burial shroud? I would admit, yeah, finding paint would be problematic. That the shroud images were composed of paint would be problematic. It's hard to see that as being true. But then Hugh himself says, well, maybe it was touched up. And he gives that possibility 5%. Well, that's funny because Hugh with the blood stains, he gives that way more. He says there's blood and it was touched up. So if the blood stains were touched up with pigment at some point, why couldn't the body images have been touched up with pigment at some point? You only give that a 5% possibility? I'm wondering if it's so low because you actually know that Walter Macrone, it's BS, that the images weren't touched up. They're made of dehydrated cellulose. And that's why that should be 0% if that's the way you're thinking. But then it's inexplicable why you have 95% here. These numbers are not warranted or even warranted-ish. You're outside the reasonableness range. And look, let me find a clip of Hugh Farey admitting Walter Macrone full of it.
I want to switch gears here because here's going to be something where we're all three of us, or all three of you guys, are going to agree, and myself included, but I'm the host. But it's the fact that, look, Macrone was absolutely out to lunch and wrong. There is blood on the bloodstains. Is blood. Now, Hugh may have a bit of nuance where he thinks there's blood and paint. So, Hugh, I want to hear your take on the blood stains. What exactly is your view? Is there blood and paint? What do you think?
I mean, sometimes you come to a decision and you're pretty clear. All the evidence is mostly on this side and hardly any on the other side. In the case of the blood, I think the evidence is finely balanced. But I prepare to argue with fellow medievalists that the blood is actual blood. Yes, I think there are so many tests for it that although any particular one, you can find bilirubin in all sorts of things. Porphyrins are found all over the place and so on. But we've got such a lot that you think, well, you could assemble all the ingredients so that you had a fake blood that nevertheless matched all the tests that were done. But really, it would have been easier just to use blood. And also, there's no particular reason why it shouldn't be blood. I think I got very excited by Caroline Biner Walkham's description of the extraordinary, masochistic or sadistic almost blood cults of the Cistercians, especially the South German Cistercian nuns of the late of the early late 12th, 13th, 13th, 14th centuries. And you just think it'd be entirely in keeping for somebody to put real blood onto it like that.
Hugh, are you aware of any examples of actual cloths that have painted blood on it?
No, not till the 20th century, where various artists have made paint out of blood.
Even though Hugh's a Shroud skeptic, he doesn't agree with the traditional painting hypothesis. So Yeah, Hugh, I'm interested to hear your take. What's your take on Walter Macron's painting hypothesis?
Well, I've got one or two things. I have to say that I agree that there was bad blood between some members of Stirp and Walter Macron, and I think they were quite rude to each other. And I regret that terribly, because he made some observations which were simply denied. I think at one point, Eric Jumper said he couldn't see any orange dots on the shroud at all, which just didn't seem to make any sense. I'm going to share the screen again, if I may. All the times 40 slides from Macron's book. And you see that I haven't photocopied it very well. I've just slammed it down on my on the scanner and scanned. Now, we've got lots of red dots all over the place. Now, I don't know whether he selected them specially or whether they're typical. Some of them, like up on the top right-hand side where it says small of back, well, we might suppose that that would be a blood area. And then down on the third line down, we've got blood belt, which might also be a blood area. But on just to the left of it is finger, which has also got some of these very similar red dots on it. And then down at the foot, things covered in red dots. And there are masses of dots about. And we might say, well, there aren't enough dots to make an image. Or, I mean, according to Macron, there were. Now, I disagree with him. But to say there are no particles on the shroud or on the fibers is observationally incorrect. And I think it's very easy to go through a series of Chinese whispers, and without actually looking for yourself, you can't get back to some kind of basis of what was actually there. I mean, it's all very well Macron saying that Shroud is heaped with the stuff. Well, obviously it isn't.
So guys, as you can see, that it's complete bunk. That 95% Walter Macron was correct. Hugh says no, he wasn't. But here he's saying 95% that he's correct, and given he's correct, that proves it's medieval. This is 0%. It's a non sequitur. Just even if it is paint and Walter's correct, that doesn't prove it's medieval at all. And secondly, Walter Macron is not correct. You just heard Hugh Farey admit he was full of it. He's not. It's not true. The shroud is not composed of paint. The shroud images, body and bloodstain images. And secondly, even if it was composed of paint, that doesn't prove anything, because maybe the images were just touched up with paint, maybe in the 1500s or something like that. Just like Hugh believes happened with the bloodstains. That's certainly more than 5%. Like you said, with the bloodstains, he thinks he's about 50-50 is what Hugh said. Why can't it be the same with the body images? Again, that's on condition that Walter Macron is correct. And as Hugh said, Walter Macron was not correct. So Hugh's not a reasonable person here in assessing the Bayes factor for Walter Macron's evidence. Now, the final thing is textile expert findings, and he appeals to one piece of evidence, Shroud's skeptical piece of evidence from the foreshaft treacle loom. And he says the textile experts to examine the shroud mostly inclined towards authenticity, right? So the most textile experts favor the pro-authenticity stance, scholarly consensus on our side, but have generally supposed that a treacle loom, unknown in the 1st century, must have been used to weave the cloth, and the only attempt ever made to weave some shroud-like material on a warp-weighted loom resulted in the weaver declaring it impossible. Hugh's a lot more generous here, and this surprises me. 30% versus carbon-14 dating. I think so first of all, I don't think it should be reversed, but I'm shocked because, look, even as a pro-shroud person, I think Hugh is correct about the textile findings overall supporting the shroud skeptics. I think this is the best argument. Forget the carbon-14 dating proves nothing. Darcy Memorandum proves nothing. Walter Macron doesn't prove nothing, but in terms of what he's saying here, proves nothing. His red ochre findings, there's doubts galore and stuff like that. But the textile argument, even all things considered, so the problem with Hugh is that he only considers one argument. There are dozens of arguments, pro and con. And I did an entire presentation on the textile evidence. So here, and I used Bayes' theorem for this. So let's take a look at that. So remember, I did my Shroud panel review summary show where I assessed all of the different pro textile and contra textile or skeptical textile arguments. And I assessed them according to Bayes' theorem, and I assigned my degrees of warrant and stuff for each argument, including the weaving defects and Hugh Farey's argument about the warp-weighted loom versus the treacle loom, deciding in Hugh's favor on that argument. And also the no regulators argument, proving the pro-shroud side and that Hugh Farey is wrong. This was another strong one. Hugh had never heard of this argument before, although since my show, he came up with a counter blog trying to respond to this, where I think he raised some good counters. So anyways, on the basis of this, I did my combined probability and arrived at 57.14% probability that the shroud is not medieval and therefore consistent with the 1st century ancient authentic date, given all of the textile arguments and evidences combined, not just based on one evidential indicator, like Hugh Farey says in his blog. And I'm glad that he's a little bit more generous, 30%, but this is still too high. 90% that it's medieval, given the textile, that's too high, I think. But again, he's just going off this one finding, shroud skeptical, and he's ignoring all of the pro-shroud textile arguments. And I like that Hugh gives the 30 percentile mark here and stuff like that for the pro-shroud side. Again, given just the 4-shaft treacle loom, I think this actually would fall within the reasonableness range. Given just this one argument, shroud skeptical argument in isolation, I think him assigning a 30 percentile mark that the shroud is historically authentic on this basis in isolation falls within the reasonableness range. I think I would give that to him there. So yeah, that's it for each of the 4 Bayes factors that assessments that Hugh gives. And from there, it's just a calculation. So yeah, he's got garbage in. He's got unreasonable inputs, objectively provable unreasonable inputs. It's objectively proven from Hugh Farey himself. I quoted Hugh saying that this is BS and these numbers are garbage and rubbish. So yeah, I think that's pretty strong here. So unfortunately, yeah, thanks for proving the Bayesian method is valid. Again, you got to be concerned with garbage in, garbage out, as Hugh was not concerned with this. He was purposefully providing garbage to make the point that everybody knows about, that garbage in, garbage out with Bayes' theorem, of course. That's why we've got to do our best not to put in not to have garbage inputs. We assess properly, not just a guesstimate, how are we feeling today, but we dive into the things to evaluate our degree of warrant, subjective degree of warrant or warrantedishness, given, or reasonable justification, whatever you want to call it, given, so our percentile of credence, given the objective evidence. We present objective reasons justifying that degree of credence we're giving. And in this case, the reason Hugh's point fails, to discredit Bayesian usage and stuff is because his inputs are provably garbage. He himself has said they're garbage. These are just made up to try and discredit Bayes' theorem. And for that reason, it fails to discredit the theorem. We always knew garbage in, garbage out. But the point that people like me and others are providing is that we're not giving garbage in. We've got good objective reasons behind the probability values we're assigning. And therefore, Bayes' theorem works properly. GIGO works both ways. You have garbage in, garbage out. But if you have good stuff in, you got good stuff out. It works both ways. So this is another failure on Hugh's. Bayesian Balderdash? No. Bayesian brilliance, Hugh. Get that straight. All right, let's move on to the third and final fan request from Annette Cloutier. And I'm going to do a thing on Nicholas Allen. So first of all, let me play some clips because James Tabor has gone for Nicholas Allen's proto-photo hypothesis. He thinks it's brilliant. He thinks it explains the Shroud images fully and perfectly. So let me just play a couple clips from the Shroud skeptics, James Tabor, and then Nicholas Allen on his method here. Okay, so this is a clip of biblical scholar Dr. James Tabor giving credit to Nicholas Allen for fully explaining the Shroud's body and bloodstain images.
Hello, everyone. Yesterday, I released a video about the discovery of the tomb of the Shroud in Jerusalem in the year 2000. I was involved in that, so watch that video. I think you'll find it fascinating and interesting. In this video, I want to play for you a slideshow presented by Dr. Nicholas Allen. It was originally on Jacob Berman's channel, History Valley, and I'm presenting this with their permission to my YouTube viewers as well, because I think Dr. Allen has explained how the Turin Shroud was made. It first came to light in the early 14th century, and the only carbon 14 dates we have on it also put it at that time. Look, I'm well aware of all of the objections. I've followed Shroud studies now since 1970. I guess that would be, what, 50 years? I think I've read just about everything out there. And I know people put in comments, all kinds of things. Tabor doesn't know this, Tabor doesn't know that. I'm not saying I know everything, and I don't claim to be a Shroud expert on a scientific level. However, Allen is, and what he presents is, I think, very convincing.
Here is Nicholas Allen describing his own technique in his own words on the Jacob Berman's History Valley podcast. So credit to Nicholas Allen and the History Valley podcast. Go and check out. There's the name, The Shroud Fraud, How the Shroud of Turin Deceived Everyone with Dr. Nicholas Peter Lay Allen. So that's the video. Make sure you give them credit. But let me just have Nicholas Allen describe his technique in his own words.
In the Islamic world, we have people of the caliber of Al-Hatham, who wrote texts explaining how you could make an image inside a camera with a pinhole. And what he did was he put a candle outside a box, and then inside the box he observed that the candle was visible upside down. And down and below is a color picture showing you that principle. Al-Hatham was a very clever man. He also worked out that light travels in straight lines. He's the first person to do that. This is centuries before Newton. Before this time, everybody thought that light mingled. Al-Hatham put 3 candles in a row and then snuffed out the lights one by one to see what happened inside the camera. And he noticed that the opposite light went out every time he snuffed a candle out, proving that light travels in perfectly straight lines. He went further than this. He also worked out how binocular vision worked. He worked out why the moon appears large on the horizon. And he also worked out how rainbows were formed. Now, following Al-Hatham's example, if you have an object illuminated by light on the left, standing next to an aperture or a hole, say in the wall of a large room, inside the room, you will get an inverted image of what was outside the room, but it will be made up of a series of holes, basically. So you have a blurred image. Okay, so we talk about the object conjugate distance and the image conjugate distance. This is a self-working phenomenon. You don't need any fancy tools to do this. If you put a lens in that hole and focus the light, then the image on the right becomes focused and is as sharp as the original object that was standing outside.
Okay, so that's Nicholas Allen in his own words. And you can see I've done a solo show video giving a detailed assessment of some of the problems and failures with Nicholas Allen's proto-photo hypothesis. So this is the image he got on the left compared to the actual Shroud of Turin man. So you can see there are various issues such as directionality of light, obviously facing down, that, and non-body image uniformity. There are holes in the Shroud Man's and Nicholas Allen's image. There are various problems with his image as to why it's a failure to explain the Shroud of Turin's images, and I cover those in my Shroud solo show, Part 11C, Sunlight-Based Hypotheses, where I cover Nicholas Allen's proto-photo hypothesis, the shadow hypothesis of Nathan Wilson, which is another hypothesis James Tabor has linked to on his Patreon page. Former student of Gary Habermas, kind of works the opposite. He says the images are not produced by light, but the shadows. The light bleaches the cloth, leaving behind the non-bleached part based on a stained glass window. So, and I also covered the solar reflex model as well, a less convincing thing, but it utilizes sunlight to create the Shroud images. So check out this show where I give detailed critique. Again, photo credit to Nicholas Allen for this image. I obtained it from permission from Barry Schwartz, and Barry Schwartz got permission from Nicholas Allen to show this. Now, it's important to note that this view, even Nicholas Allen, and listen to the show with Nicholas Allen on History Valley. I think it's a fascinating, great presentation. He does a great job presenting his views and arguing for its plausibility historically and that sort of thing. But again, ultimately, I think it does fail. But forget about me. I'm a pro-Shroud expert, right? So I'm biased in some ways, you might think. Well, what did the Shroud skeptics themselves have to say? Let's go to first with Joe Nickell, who talked about this on the famous Skeptical Inquirer, Shroud skeptic. This is what he said about Nicholas Allen. Center for Inquiry, on the blog page, Joe Nickell wrote a blog where he says the following. As in the past, Shroud proponents have fooled many, beginning with themselves, by claiming the Shroud is a perfect photographic negative, which no artist could have produced in the Middle Ages. In fact, the Shroud image is not photographic, since the positive image shown in reversals of the image exhibits a figure with white hair and beard, the opposite of what would be expected for Jesus. The image in the cloth is therefore a quasi-negative. Now, that hasn't been proven. Joe Nickell is wrong about that, but he might be right. It could be a quasi-negative or a full negative image, because we would have the same effect if the hair was blonde or light brown too, not necessarily just white. Anyways, continuing on, exactly like that produced by an artistic rubbing technique. Nevertheless, the CNN documentary Finding Jesus chooses for its token Shroud skeptic a straw man in the form of Nicholas Allen. Allen takes the word photographic quite literally and proposes that the Shroud was the world's first photograph. In this affront to Occam's razor, the principle that the hypothesis with the fewest assumptions is to be preferred, Nicholas Allen proposes that the medieval forger actually invented photography. Specifically, he suggests the forger used a camera obscura, or in Latin, dark chamber, or a pinhole camera, one the size of a room, but newly outfitted with crystal lenses. The newly invented film would be a linen sheet treated with silver sulfate or silver nitrate. And in the video, Allen explains why silver sulfate is best. It gives kind of a purplish color and stuff like that, just like the Shroud. He claims the Shroud of Turin has. But then Joe Nickell says, although no silver has ever been found on the Shroud of Turin. Remember, this is a Shroud skeptic saying this. Nicholas Allen rationalizes it could have been, for some reason, washed off with urine, specifically the ammonia in the urine. The subject would have to have been an immobile figure. Allen used a plaster human body cast hanging in the sun in such a way that light struck it equally during morning and afternoon. After several days, the forger would have an image he could then paint on with temporal paint to produce blood on the various wound sites. Although even then, the results would not be Shroud-like. I suggest that after the forger invented all this technology, which went unused and unknown for nearly the next 500 years, he could have invented the telephone or talked with others about it. Then he could have invented the automobile and driven to the Riviera for a much-needed rest. With this absurd explanation on the Shroud's image, Nicholas Allen has played right into the hands of Shroud propagandists. They use him to endorse the falsehood that the image is a photographic negative, then allow his far-fetched notion to make skeptics look ridiculous in their desperation. The result is to make religion seem to trump science. Shroud activists are no doubt laughing all the way to the cathedral. So these are some scathing words from a fellow Shroud skeptic, Joe Nickel. No friends of Christians, godless atheist, hated religion, dedicated his life to making us look superstitious, foolish, country little bumpkins and stuff like that. And he's kind of treating Nicholas Allen the way he does innocent Christians, and very scathing words. And I know Nicholas Allen did not appreciate Joe Nickel's words here. Now, another thing I should mention is that the journal Nature, Nicholas Allen mentions he tried to get his technique published in the science journal Nature, and they rejected it.
When I first wrote about my findings back in the 1980s, I sent a copy of one of my articles to Nature. Now, Nature is supposed to be the top journal in the world for new discoveries and new research. They refused to publish the article because the referee that they employed to check my work said that there was not possible for anybody in the Middle Ages to make a lens out of quartz. That all they were capable of doing was producing crude balls.
So again, these are skeptics. These are people that aren't pro-Christian, pro-Shroud scientists saying, no, your theory's not good enough. And Nicholas Allen attributes this, well, for one of the reasons the reviewers said is you can't get a crystal quartz lens focused necessary to the necessary quality needed to create these images. Only since the 19th century have we had lenses like that. And I know Nicholas Allen addresses that in his presentation. So watch that stuff to get both sides and stuff like that of the debate. I won't go into that here, but just understand, even the journal Nature heard about his technique, saw his results, and they rejected it as totally implausible as a technique. So again, these are not biased pro-Shroud Christians that are rejecting it. Finally, we have the ultimate Shroud skeptic, Hugh Farey.
I just want to go over to you. So obviously, one thing to announce is I invited people on, such as Nicholas Allen, as well as Nathan Wilson and the scientist he worked with. And I even invited on, I got so desperate, I even invited on Prince and Picknett, who also go for the proto photo, but they all declined to be on. But with Nicholas Allen, he did provide me his book, which he gave me permission to post on my blog for free for this show. So if you want to see the positive proto photo side, Nicholas Allen has generously let me post up his book for free.
And if you're interested, definitely see Nicholas Allen's side, because he wasn't on this show. So see his presentation on the History Valley podcast that, again, will be linked in my blog for this show. But also his book, read it for free. I consulted it myself. Under the Shroud Panel Review on my Real Seekers channel, Shroud Panel Review Part 9, if you go down to the YouTube video description and click on my blog page, you'll see the recommended sources. And under that, you have Turin Shroud, Testament to a Lost Technology by Nicholas Allen. If you click on that, you can get this for free and read Nicholas Allen's entire book, where he goes into all the details of his hypothesis and stuff like that. So I just want to make sure I'm supporting, look at both sides, be a real seeker and stuff like that. But back to, what does Hugh think of this proto-photo, Nicholas Allen's proto-photo hypothesis?
So you read him in his own words. But with that said, I'm here with Hugh. So Hugh, I want to turn it to you. Can you describe what is the proto-photo hypothesis, and what is that technique entail?
I think essentially what we need to see is that in theory, photography could have been invented a great deal earlier than we think it was. And I don't think anybody disagrees with that. It's just that there's absolutely no evidence for it. We do know that even the Romans used lenses, I think possibly beginning with just accidental blobs of glass, but then slowly refining them, even as spectacles. And certainly the early Middle Ages, spectacles were quite common. So lenses were certainly available if you needed to focus light onto a particular spot. And also the large version of the pinhole camera, the camera obscura, had been known for a very long time, perhaps from about 1150 or so onwards, if not before then. I can't remember the exact historical origins of it. But you can imagine then that light could be, and probably was, focused onto a what we might call a retina or a back screen of some kind.
Mhm.
And the problem, which we don't know whether anybody, yeah, that'll do. We don't know whether anybody actually thought about this or not. The problem is how to fix the image that you've got. Getting the image is not a problem. It's holding it there once you've got it. And there are various different ways of doing it, of which all the proto photographer people have come up with a slightly different plan. The main problem with all these theories is that it was such a momentous discovery from the moment people started to be able to fix the image that everybody publicized it. Everybody was working on it like mad. It was common knowledge that there were good photos and bad photos. It was such an exciting thing to happen. So the idea that somebody could have invented this and then there was absolutely no further investigation into it for another 500 years or so, that's what I find particularly far-fetched.
Okay, so that is the ultimate Shroud skeptic, Hugh Farey. So it's not just biased pro-Shroud people who have problems with Nicholas Allen's theory. That said, rather than get into another detailed evaluation, I've covered them on previous shows, as I mentioned to you, but I also have a short clip from the pro-Shroud photography expert, Barry Schwartz. He was the official photographer for the Shroud of Turin during the Shroud of Turin research project. And he gives his own short little presentation on why Nicholas Allen's medieval photograph proto-photo hypothesis just doesn't work based on the scientific evidence. So I just want to replay Barry, out of respect, replay Barry's quick little kind of take on Nicholas Allen's theory. And then I'll finish off by getting into Annette's question on something specific Nicholas Allen brought up in his presentation on the History Valley channel that I've never heard before as a pro-Shroud expert here, or from any of the pro-Shroud experts. But let's listen to Barry first and foremost.
Okay, here's maybe my favorite part, because this is really right up my alley. The Shroud image is a medieval photograph, possibly produced by Leonardo da Vinci. Now, before I start this, let me first give great credit to Professor Nicholas Allen. Professor Allen took the initiative to create a camera obscura to do an experiment to demonstrate his theory. He hung a statue outside of the camera obscura, and so I give him great credit, because unlike so many of these others who postulate ideas, like Joan Nichol never actually made a scorched image, Nicholas Allen made a photographic image and did it superbly based on the techniques that he used. So I want to start by giving him credit for that. But let's talk first about what the camera obscura is, for those who might not know. Basically, it's a dark room, and in that dark room, you'll see there's a small hole at the opposite end of the room, and there is a statue that's outside that room, out in the sunlight. According to Nicholas Allen, it took 4 days to expose his film, if you will. That film is on a piece of cloth that he had soaked in a silver salt solution, because silver is light sensitive. That's what we used in photographic film and X-ray film. And so he created an image. The only problem I have with it right off the top of my head is that hanging a body for 4 days in the sunlight, you're not going to get the same result that you get on the Shroud, because it may start looking like a body at the beginning of those 4 days, but at the end of those 4 days, not so much. So, but I give him great credit. And Allen claimed that in the case of the Shroud, the sheet was coated with a light-sensitive photographic emulsion, primarily made of silver salt, and he used human urine to fix the image. Okay, uric acid can function as a fixer in the photographic process. To his credit, Nicholas Allen used this technique to produce a beautiful photographic image using a camera obscura and a life-size sculpture. This is his photograph, which he gave me permission to use in about 1998, I think. Picknett and Clive Prince, two British authors, not only agreed with Allen, but further suggested that this technique was in fact employed by Leonardo da Vinci to create the Shroud. So they took Allen's theory and sort of went beyond that. Now, Nicholas Allen, the one thing he didn't do is he never made a side-by-side comparison of his camera obscura results with the image on the Shroud. No reasonable conclusion can be drawn without just such a comparison. For example, Allen's photograph shows a strong directionality of light from above. There's a shadow under the chin, under the cheekbones, under the chest, under the hands. His knee and his feet are overexposed. His left arm is overexposed. So that's what you would get with a long exposure photographic image with a light source coming from above. You would get those shadows. Look at the Shroud, however. There's no directionality of light evident on the Shroud at all, in no direction of light. Now, the STIRP data proved, and Ray Rogers wouldn't let me use that word very often, I have to admit, but the STIRP data proved that the image on the Shroud was darkest as a point where the body and cloth came in direct physical contact, and at the tip of the nose, top of the hands. The image grew more faint as the distance between cloth and body increased. And this result cannot be accomplished or duplicated using any photographic artistic mechanism that requires some form of direct interaction between the cloth and the body. That's the only way you can do this. Now, here's an example. The cloth was lifted away from the torso. I mentioned this earlier, by the hands crossed over the torso. This lifted the cloth away from the torso itself. And if you'll look closely, you'll see that images made by light would not have this property. And you can see a kind of a halo surrounding the hands where there's more faint, the image around the hands is more faint of the torso. And you can see that lighter halo. And here, let me circle it. Within that circle, the background or torso of the body is much more faint than other areas of the torso where the contact was either more direct or closer. And again, you can see that here. Let me see if I can take that out of there. So you can kind of see that dark area around the hands. That's where the torso was further away and created a more faint image and darker on the light, dark, reverse negative view. Allen's result also shows a very distinct and sharp edge around the entire image, which one would expect from a properly focused photograph. And he did a good job in that respect. But the Shroud image has no distinct edges. The image at the periphery just fades away as the distance between the cloth and the body grew greater. The image grows more faint until it just disappears. There are no hard edges anywhere on the Shroud's image. Allen makes no attempt to explain the blood and how it got on the cloth. So give the man credit. He did something that Ray Rogers and Al Adler, who used to yell at me, do an experiment, would be very pleased with. He did an experiment, and he just didn't go all the way to make the comparison that I've made to show that, although he did a great job, he did not match the properties of the Shroud of Turin. So what I think, and here I'm going to talk about it, I guess, no light-sensitive photographic emulsion or any associated silver salts were found anywhere on the Shroud. And we had highly sensitive spectral and chemical analysis. Our pyrolysis mass spec could, I believe, detect 1 part per billion with a B. Allen claims that the silver salts were removed completely when he fixed the image. However, the fixer in the photographic process only removes the unused silver not necessary to create the image. What silver remains on the image is what's responsible for the image. If it were all removed, there would be no image as well. The image would be gone. If the Shroud were made photographically, we would have found silver everywhere on that cloth, and even more so in the image areas. Now look, Nicholas said that in at least one of his later attempts, that he actually took the cloth and soaked it in a silver solution, liquid silver solution. Well, that means it would have penetrated via capillarity through the entire cloth. And we'd have found silver everywhere. We didn't find any silver except for one microscopic little bead, tiny little bead of silver that may have come from the reliquary from the 1532 fire. We can't say that for sure, but that's the most plausible answer for that. And I just told you all that, so we can move on. By the way, not one example of a photographic image exists prior to the documented invention of photography in approximately 1826, and that photograph still exists. There it is. That was by Joseph Nicephore Niepce. I believe he was either French or Italian, I'm not sure. But that's the first photographic negative attributed, and of course I got this from Wikipedia, so you can see the link there. And here is the peer-reviewed journaled article, again from Applied Optics, the UV reflectance and fluorescent spectra of the Shroud of Turin. I also had Kevin Moran, may he rest in peace, apply, he had a VP8 image analyzer, and so we asked him to take a Nicholas Allen photo and put it in the VP8 and see what kind of results we got. We did not get the natural relief of the human face like we see on the right there. The mouth is sunken, the chin is raised, the hair is raised, the chest is elevated. Compare that to the relatively undistorted nature of the Shroud's facial features. That's what makes it significant, that the VP8 revealed the natural relief of a human form. No other photograph to date that we've tested that way does so. The Shroud does. And that, to me, as an imaging guy, tells me there had to be some correlation between the body and the cloth when the image formed. It's not a painting, scorch, or a medieval photograph. There, and here's the paper on the three-dimensional characteristics again. Now, let's talk about Leonardo da Vinci. He was born on April 15th, 1452. The first documented public exhibition of the Shroud of Turin occurred in 1355, almost 100 years before Leonardo was born. He was a great artist, but he wasn't that good. So, you know, and look, this is a self-portrait. So, and look, Leonardo was so good at documenting everything. We even know the color of the shoelaces of his assistant. And if he had created something like the Shroud of Turin, he wouldn't have kept it a secret. He was a smart man and knew how to promote himself and did very well for himself, even in his own time. And that is what we know for sure.
Okay, so this is the last part. So this is a fan request for you, Annette. So during Nicholas Allen's presentation, he mentioned something that I hadn't heard before that was interesting about the Pilgrim's badge. And he says, if you look right here, some medieval people thought that the Shroud of Turin had a chain around it, or as Picknett and Prince say, it's a tied rope across the small of the man's back. Now, this is obviously referring to the blood belt. It's made of blood, it's red and stuff like that. So you can see it on the Shroud of Turin, right? So here's the blood belt right there as you look at it. This is the blood belt across the man's back on the Shroud of Turin. Clearly it's red, so it's made of blood. I doubt very much that medieval people thought this was a chain or that sort of thing. Maybe it was bloodstains forming around a chain, I'm not sure. But anyways, let's just play a couple things from Nicholas Allen, which I didn't know about in terms of medieval supposedly thinking this was a chain.
This is a pilgrim badge, or what left of a pilgrim badge, showing two priests holding up a length of cloth, and below it you can see the coat of arms of Geoffroy de Charnay II and de Vergy, his wife, underneath, Jean de Vergy. And you can clearly see in this piece of lead an attempt by the artist to depict what we now call the Shroud of Turin. You can see the man on the left looking at you, the frontal image, and then almost joined at the head, we see a dorsal image. And remember I spoke about that funny chain of blood across the back, which medieval people thought was a chain. Well, the artist here has depicted it as a chain running across the back of the man. And because of that chain, we're pretty sure and confident that this is an attempt to depict what we now call the Shroud of Turin. Recently, very recently, in 2012, they found a mold at a place called Masson, which is very close to Lierre, And unfortunately, it is damaged. But if you were to try to repair it and pull out a print, you can see that it is also very similar to the previous Pilgrim badge. Now, a Pilgrim badge is something that you would obviously pay money for. You'd go on a pilgrimage to the church to say that you had seen Jesus on the cloth, and then you'd pay money and you'd get a Pilgrim badge so that you could tell your friends back home that you went on that pilgrimage.
Okay, so that's the claim. And the claim is this. So according to Nicholas Allen, medieval people thought the blood belt on the Shroud of Turin, the back, small of the back of the shroud man on the Shroud of Turin, is actually a chain. Now, I tried to look this up, and there are no historical documents anywhere in the medieval period that ever refer to this as a chain. So I was trying to figure out at least where does this claim come from. And looking at Nicholas Allen's book on my blog, there was a couple paragraphs I could find on it. From not the medieval period, but the 1500s. They say it's chain-like. The blood belt is chain-like. And this is in contrast to the other proto-photo hypothesis, Picknett and Prince, who Nicholas Allen disagrees with, who said it was a rope, a tightly twisted rope. Nonetheless, despite these striking correspondences, Picknett and Prince make the following bogus statement. There is one feature, however, that is clearly visible on the metal, the Pilgrim's badge that we just learned about, that is not present on the Turin shroud, a curious thick twisted band like a rope across the width of the cloth at the small of the figure's back. What this is anybody's guess. And Nicholas Allen says about these fellow proto-photo skeptics, this is a deliberate red herring. What these authors fail to tell their readers is that on the metal, a thick twisted rope not only traverses the small of the dorsal figure's back, but also may be observed as an ambiguous relief pattern to either side of the feet in both the dorsal and the frontal impressions. All of these patterns, including the quote-unquote twisted rope, run at right angles to the direction of the body image. It is not interesting that on the Shroud of Turin may be found a line of trickled blood running across the small of the dorsal figure's back, and that the scorch marks which now appear on the cloth as a result of fire damage in 1532, may very well conceal the continuation of this pattern beyond the boundaries of the figure itself. Blood is trickled quite freely at the site of the feet, more so on the dorsal image than the frontal depiction. This latter feature is reflected quite accurately on the lead Pilgrim medal from Leary. As an aside, it is also worth mentioning here that when the Clarices repaired the shroud after the 1532 fire, they remarked at the time about what they perceived to be quote-unquote chain marks running across the small of the back of the image. If, as these authors assert, the shroud had been switched by 1492, then what these poor nuns of St. Clair what are they referring to between the years 1532 to 1534? After all, no quote-unquote chain marks appear on the Shroud of Turin today. So quite obviously, the Clarices misinterpreted the line of trickled blood, as did the anonymous artist who produced the Pilgrim medal before 1418. So that's what this is about here in At. This is what Nicholas Allen is talking about. It's clearly not a chain, not twisted rope or anything like that. It's just the blood belt on the back of the shroud man, which all pro-shroud experts are familiar with. Medical experts studying it have mentioned this trickled blood known as the blood belt. And Nicholas Allen is agreeing with the pro-shroud experts on that and saying that in the 1500s, the nuns who repaired the shroud after the 1532 fire damage referred to it as chain-like marks or chain marks running across the small of the back of the image. But this, I don't think there's any reason to think that medieval people thought there was an actual chain. I mean, it's colored red. You can clearly see this is blood, not a chain or anything like that. So I'm not sure about Nicholas Allen's interpretation of the Pilgrim's medallion showing a chain going off the body. There's certainly something going on there. But yeah, I could find no evidence historically of medieval documents of people in the 1300s, mid-14th century, talking about the blood belt being a chain. across the small of the back and extending beyond the body. So I think this is just Nicholas Allen kind of taking what people said in the 1500s and a off-the-cuff comment or something, and then linking that to the Pilgrim's medallion, an odd feature that we can't explain on the Pilgrim's medallion. That's all that's going on there. So yeah, I hope that helps, Annette. But yeah, other than that, that is everything for this episode on the Shroud of Turin updates. I hope it was helpful. Enjoy and take care, guys.